Hi everyone. Today I want to talk about the eligibility of students when it comes to the CRB, the Canada Recovery Benefit. Now, obviously up until September, there was the Canada Emergency Student Benefit, the CESB, and this $1,250 monthly payment was specifically targeting students. So now that it has ended, many students are left wondering where they fit into the new CRB scheme and whether they meet the new requirements. Now, for clarification, students in this new CRB context could also technically include high school or secondary school students. This was not the case in the CESB, where you had to either be enrolled in a post-secondary program or just about to start before February 2021, or just having graduated from it since December 2019. But in this new CRB scheme, what type of student you are doesn't matter, whether secondary or post-secondary, as long as you are at least 15 years old for the first day of the period you are applying for. So having cleared that up, now we want to get to the main issues that are going to determine whether a student is going to be eligible for the CRB. And to make this determination, it depends on your situation. So the answer to this isn't going to be yes, all students are eligible, or no, no students are eligible. The answer for everybody is going to be a maybe, depending on how your situation matches up with the requirements. And remember, your situation is supposed to be reassessed for every 2-week period you are applying for the CRB. So don't just look at your situation once in October 2020, and then because you meet the requirements then, you think you're eligible to keep applying for the CRB until next year. No. You treat every 2-week period you are applying for completely separately because you have been eligible before and now you're not eligible, or the opposite. You might not have been eligible before and now you lost your job due to COVID and you are eligible. So remember this 2-week period aspect. Okay, so let's get into the specific requirements. The first simple requirement that students would need to satisfy is the $5,000 requirement, which is that if you're applying for a 2-week period in 2020, you had to have at least a total income of $5,000 in 2019, or if you didn't have $5,000 of income in 2019, you had to have had it in the 12-month period preceding the date of your application. For some students, this might be a problem because maybe they had a part-time job working only a small amount, but for others, this shouldn't be an issue. The main reason this is in place is that they want you to be in the workforce recently, right? So if you haven't worked in like 3 years and then all of a sudden you're coming in to claim benefits that you should be entitled to because you're unemployed due to COVID, well, you're going to have a hard time proving that because COVID or not, you weren't working before anyway. Keep in mind that the entire purpose of this CRB law is to help people who are losing their jobs or facing serious decreases in income because of COVID specifically. This is not just a check you get because times are tough. And so I had said that technically if you are a 15-year-old student, you could apply. Well, for those younger high school students, it might be tough to meet this first requirement because they might not have been in the workforce long enough to earn the $5,000 threshold. Alright, so the next requirement. You are not employed or self-employed due to the COVID-19 pandemic or are working and have had a reduction of at least 50% in your employment or self-employment income for reasons related to COVID-19. Okay, so how would this relate to students? Well, if you were working in the summer and then your job ended, your contract, your internship, whatever it was, it ended, or you voluntarily quit your job to make time for your full-time school term, that doesn't count. You wouldn't qualify for CRB because in these scenarios, the reason you're not employed anymore is not because of COVID-19. Reasons related to COVID-19 have to be why you are not working right now, not the fact that you're going back to school. And this is similar with respect to this 50% reduction in income part. Let's say you were working full-time in the summer, and then now you've reduced your hours to part-time, again to make room for school, then you wouldn't qualify. But if you were going to continue working full-time during the year, and then because of COVID-19 your hours got reduced, then you would qualify. And when they say reasons related to COVID-19, what does that mean? It means maybe you work at a gym or someplace that's been ordered to be shut down because of COVID, or maybe you work at a restaurant or something that's not shut down, but business has become so slow because of COVID that you're laid off or your hours are reduced to the point that you're making less than 50% of your usual income. Those would be some examples of reasons related to COVID-19. Generally issues related to public health policy or economic impact that has either shut down your job or really reduced how much you work or make. And these are reasons that are related to COVID-19, but not directly due to COVID-19. So it's not that you've been forced to quarantine and can't work, because that would instead qualify you for the Canada Recovery Sickness Benefit, which pays out the same amount as the CRB, but you would apply for that one separately on the CRA website for whatever 2-week period. And for those of you that are wondering about this 50% reduction in income part, what does that mean specifically? How do we calculate it? We can look at the Canada Recovery Benefits Act, the law that created the CRB, to see how we're supposed to calculate this. So in subsection F here, it tells us that if you're applying for a 2-week period in 2020, then you take the income you were going to make or did make in that 2-week period you're applying for and compare it to your total average weekly employment income and self-employment income for 2019 or in the 12-month period preceding the day on which you make the application. So whether your pay is based on salary or hourly wage, you might have to divide by 52 weeks for the year or multiply by 40 hours a week. You're going to end up calculating what your average weekly income is. And then you'll have two numbers to work with. There's your average for 2019, the calendar year 2019, which you should have a good sense of already because you've presumably done your tax returns for it. And then there's the 12 months preceding the day you make the application. So if you were going to apply for the next available CRB period, which starts October 26th, this would be your average weekly income from October 26, 2019 to October 26, 2020. For many people, their average weekly income may have decreased in 2020 because of the pandemic. So when you use this 12-month preceding time period to calculate your average weekly income, it's going to give you a smaller number. Because the law in subsection F says or, that means you can use both of these numbers and see if one of them, compared to the 2-week period you're applying for, has resulted in a 50% decrease in your average weekly income. As long as one of them has, then you satisfy this requirement. For this requirement, I've been thus far talking about people who had a job and stopped working or had a job and had their hours or income reduced. But what if you were already unemployed before the CRB period started? Would you be eligible to apply? This is where it gets a little bit unclear. When we look at the COVID-19 Emergency Response Act, the law that created the CERB, the CERB, Section 6 Sub 1 of that act on eligibility stated that a worker must have ceased working for reasons related to COVID-19. So that's pretty clear, that you were working and then due to COVID-19 you're no longer working. If this applied to the CRB, this would make people unemployed long before the CRB periods ineligible. But when we look at the law in the CRB, Section 3 Sub 1 Part F, which I showed you before, the language used is different. It says the person is not employed or not self-employed. It doesn't say that they were employed and stopped working or ceased working. So that could mean that if you were not working before the CRB periods, you could possibly qualify. However, the difficult part for those people is that you have to prove that you were not employed specifically because of COVID-19. So if you were a student looking for a summer job and had interviews and just couldn't get the job, you can't say that you were unemployed because of COVID, right? You have to prove that COVID was the reason you were unemployed, which is a very hard thing to prove for someone who was looking for a job. Because of course, businesses closed down, people were shopping less. Yes, there were less jobs, but you can't specifically say that COVID-19 made you unemployed the same way that someone who was already working and lost their job can. So it's kind of a very tough case to make out for those who didn't lose their job during COVID, but rather were only searching for a job during COVID. Okay, so now on to the next requirement that students want to take a look at. We're going to go back to the CRB law again, Section 3 Sub 1, and this time we're going to look at parts I and J. So what these two parts say is that for whatever 2-week period you were applying for the CRB, you had to have been looking for work and you were available for work such that you weren't restricting your availability. This requirement is probably the biggest obstacle for students to be eligible to receive the CRB. Here's why. Now, though the other requirements of the CRB don't specify between part-time and full-time jobs, which is good for students, right? Because most of them would be seeking to work part-time jobs. The problem is that being a full-time student could for many students be placing undue restrictions on your availability for work. If you are telling would-be employers you can't work on certain days because of school, you are placing undue restrictions on your availability for work. Now, the one advantage that students have this year is that because classes are almost entirely done remotely, you could potentially tell employers you are fully available because you don't have that same commitment of having to show up to class. But as I'll get to in a second, it still might be difficult to prove. So first, what is this based on? How can we tell going to full-time school is an undue restriction on your availability? Well, to start with, a little bit further down Section 3, we get to subsection 3, which lays out an exception to the availability for work definition. And it says that it doesn't count as undue restrictions if during the 2-week period you are applying for, you had a course or program that you were referred to by a provincial government or body. So what that means is that if you were doing the schooling that the government or some other official body told you to do, then you were still technically considered fully available for work. But what this exception is really telling us by implication is that any other course or program, like a normal university or college program, where you are there by your own choice rather than a government referral, you would be placing undue restriction on your availability to work, and that would disqualify you from receiving the CRB. And again, because we don't get an explicit answer in the CRB law, we can look to other laws to see if there's support for this idea. Specifically, let's look at the Employment Insurance Act, which is another federal law based on quite a similar scheme as the CRB of providing payments to unemployed people while they try to find work again. Section 18 sub 1 of the Employment Insurance Act is titled Availability for Work, and in subsection A tells us that a person is not entitled to receive EI for a day which they are not capable and available for work and unable to obtain suitable employment. This idea of availability for work is the same thing that we see in the CRB. And to see how this rule operates when it comes to full-time post-secondary students, we can look to a Federal Court of Appeal decision in 2008, Duque versus Canada. Here, a full-time university student was denied EI benefits, and the court said that, quote, "Indeed, there can be no doubt that owing to his university courses, the claimant was only available at certain times on certain days, which restricted his availability and therefore limited his chances of finding employment." This case was then cited by a decision of the federal court in July of this year called Horton versus Canada, with similar circumstances of a full-time university student applying for EI, and the court said that, quote, "A person enrolled in full-time study like Mr. Horton is presumed to be unavailable for work. This presumption is refutable only in exceptional circumstances. A claimant who is only available for employment outside of his course schedule is restricting his availability and therefore is not available for work within the meaning of the EI Act." So these cases make it clear that for EI benefits, full-time students would not be eligible. Technically, these cases aren't about the CRB, and there are no such cases on the CRB as it is too new. But my personal opinion is that it is also likely to be the same scenario for the CRB, and why I believe that is because the line of reasoning is the same. The reason that being a full-time student disqualifies you from EI is because it means there are restrictions on your availability to work, and availability to work is a requirement of receiving EI. Similarly, with the CRB, availability to work is a requirement, and restrictions on your availability to work would disqualify you. Now, the CRB law uses the word undue restrictions, but we can't rule out that undue restrictions probably also refers to full-time university or college programs or even secondary school, because the only exception we are given is courses or programs that someone is referred to by the provincial government or some other body. Now, this Horton case did say, however, that this presumption that full-time studies make you unavailable for work is refutable in exceptional circumstances. So it is technically possible for you to make out a case that as a full-time student you are available for work. But as it says, the circumstances have to be exceptional. You essentially have to prove that the employment you are applying for would take full priority over your full-time studies, essentially adapting your studies to your work. While you may be able to do this if you have lectures or classes that are entirely optional, it becomes difficult to make the same commitment for days where you have tests, exams, presentations, things like that. If you have any classes where attendance is mandatory, even if it's remote from home, you would probably not be able to prove that you're available for work, as was the case in Horton. This might seem unfair to students, but again, you have to keep in mind the overall purpose of this law, which is to provide assistance to those who are unemployed because of COVID-19, whilst pushing them to get back into employment as soon as possible. When you're a full-time student, a lot of your time is generally tied up at school. And so this will undoubtedly conflict with the time you can commit to employers as your availability and your openness to different positions to apply for based on your schedule. So the bottom line here is that this requirement of being available for work without undue restrictions is the one that students will have the toughest time proving in order to be eligible. The other part that I didn't really go into as much is that you would need to prove that you have been seeking work during the 2-week period that you're applying for. This one isn't as complicated, and to get a little more detail, we can again refer to the EI Act for some context into what this could mean. In the EI Act, this seeking of work is called making reasonable and customary efforts to obtain suitable employment. And what this consists of is talked about in the regulations of the Act under Section 9.001. So your search efforts need to be sustained, meaning continuous and extending over the 2-week period you're applying for, and your efforts need to be consistent with the type of different activities that are listed, such as preparing your resume and cover letter, networking, contacting prospective employers, attending interviews, etc. And lastly, your efforts have to be directed towards obtaining suitable employment. Suitable employment meaning positions that fit you in terms of things like your experience, qualifications, skill set. They also wouldn't be things that conflict with your moral or religious beliefs that you wouldn't perform if actually hired. You can't be applying for jobs that are completely out of your field, you would never actually do, and you have no chance in getting because those aren't suitable for you, and more importantly, they're going to hinder your ability to get back into employment as soon as possible. Now again, to reiterate, these requirements are specifically set out for the EI Act. They are not written for the CRB, but I am using this as a reference point given how similar CRB is to the EI, of the type of stuff that will likely be expected of you in the requirement of proving you are seeking work during the 2-week period. And similar to what the EI Act instructs, you probably also want to keep a detailed personal record of the activities you are doing for your job search. So the 3 requirements I covered in this video are the ones that I think are the most important in the situation of most students. This was the $5,000 prior income requirement, the loss of job due to COVID or loss of 50% of income due to COVID, and the seeking a job and availability to work requirement. There are other requirements for the CRB, but these other requirements aren't really particularly unique to students. So for example, having a valid social insurance number and not being eligible for EI. The one that I think is the most complicated among these other requirements is the requirement that you are to return to work if it is reasonable, or that you have to accept a reasonable job offer if you are given one. And so the difficulty with this requirement is, what does reasonable mean in your circumstances? And so I already covered this reasonable work requirement in my last video, so feel free to check that out if you're curious and want to learn more. I just want to stress, as always, that none of this is intended to be legal or accounting advice specific for you. This is just my own opinion for educational purposes. Anyway, I hope you found this helpful, and let me know if there are any topics that you would like me to talk about in future videos. Thanks for watching, and please make sure to hit the like button and subscribe.